This story of the Morristown ghost comes from my version of it, or edition of it, comes from 1989, when the Morristown Historical Society presented an evening fundraiser, major event. And this has to be Morris County, New Jersey's premier funny story of the, did you say entertainment? I'm not positive it's entertainment, but it's a funny story not because I make it entertaining, but you never ever find history or comedy in history. But this comedy is in history. It's a true story. It's not, you'll think I'm making it up as we go along, but I'm not making it up. Are the doors closed? Mm-hmm. We have to be careful that we don't have ghosts listening in here. You never can be too careful. Back in the tumultuous times of the American Revolution, here in New Jersey, along the crossroads of the military action, life was precarious. Personal property was not secure and often at high risk. People feared raids by foragers and enforcers, confiscating and plundering in the name of the opposing military causes. Both the rebelling patriots and the defending Tories felt vulnerable to having valuables seized in the chaos. The feeling of insecurity led some people around here to bury what gold and silver coins that they might have accumulated in the ground, in secret places, to protect their savings from being confiscated. Some folks were rumored to have buried their gold and silver out on the heights of Schooley's Mountain, 17 miles west of Morristown, maybe 11 miles west of right here. Both patriots and Tories, and even some who took neither side during the war, were believed to have buried money for safekeeping out on Schooley's Mountain. At least one patriot soldier, Private Elihu Bond, retrieved his treasure chest from the mountain after the war, and his chest found its way into the collections of Morristown National Historical Park. So Private Bond's case lends some authenticity to what might otherwise seem like a far-fetched story, even though this remarkable piece of local history is true. During the Revolution, the homes and property of Tory families who took the British side in the argument was taken over by the Patriots and sold off, including right here in Morris County. When the war ended, Tory families were banished from the new United States, exiled mostly to Canada and England. Some of them departed so hastily they could hardly gather their belongings, and some may have left before they could retrieve the gold and silver they had buried for safekeeping out on Schooley's Mountain. So the folks of Morristown, New Jersey, were still believing in the spring of 1788. But for Morristonians to go out and actually recover the treasures left behind on the mountain would not be a simple matter. Legend held that 6 men had been murdered out there and buried along with the treasure chests, so their spirits could guard the valuables from robbers. People knew that kings of Egypt had done things like that for thousands of years before, trying to protect treasures buried in their crypts with them from grave robbers. And people around here believed something like that had actually happened out on Schooley's Mountain too. The local folks were superstitious. They believed that spirits of the men who had been murdered would rise up as hobgoblins if anyone tried to dig up the buried money. Those who would go out searching for the treasures thought they would see apparitions rise around them in the form of hobgoblins, skulking ominously in the forest wherever they dared break ground. Superstition like that was rampant around here in the spring of 1788. But even though the local folks were spooked by even the thought of encountering hobgoblins, some men around Morristown were both greedy enough and bold enough to want to try anyway. The women around here, on the other hand, tended to be more skeptical and doubting, as we all know women are apt to be. The men knew how to dig productive holes in the ground very well because of all the iron mining that had been going on for 3 generations already up in the iron hills of Morris, around Mine Hill, Mount Hope, Hibernia, and Boonton. But the stout-hearted men of Morristown did not know how to dispel hobgoblins that might rise up, or how to recover the buried gold and silver without getting spooked in the process. So 5 years after the revolution ended, and with the Tories long gone, the local folks began to realize that to recover the treasures they believed left behind on Schooley's mountain would require someone with unique abilities, someone who could negotiate with the hobgoblins, someone perceptive and fearless and skillful. And yet no one around Morristown at that time was knowledgeable enough, or brave enough, or had all the unusual skills that would be needed. Much of what then happened was recorded by an eyewitness to this episode, someone who was very close to the action and was also skilled at writing, and yet someone who thought of himself as a philanthropist. The eyewitness wrote an extensive narrative about what happened 4 years after it ended and published it under the title The Morristown Ghost. Copies of the booklet are in the archival collections of the Morristown and county libraries right now. After the period of the bicentennial of the American Revolution in 1976 subsided, I got curious about Morris County in the times after the war, and I studied this unusual narrative. I found some local accounts that corroborated it and added details to what had happened and where it happened and who was involved. I was able to compare what some local historians recorded about the episode with what the eyewitness had published, trying to piece it all back together so we could better understand the whole story and see if we could really believe it. You should understand that much of the word choice in this account is just as it was written in 1792. And you'll see that the eyewitness's use of the language is quite sophisticated, which gives this local history still another educational dimension. And you should be thinking about what the writer of the Morristown Ghost narrative should have been called, if not a philanthropist. Be thinking of words like confidence man, or conjurer, or charlatan, or Pied Piper. And so it happened back in the spring of 1788 that 2 adventurous gentlemen of Morristown, New Jersey, both miners of iron, both seekers of fortune, men who were searching for better results from digging holes in the ground, were traveling up the west side of the Hudson River just north of the New York border. The 2 were looking for new places to dig and for new methods to improve their success. And they especially wanted to learn how to dispel hobgoblins that might arise to harass them as they would start digging for buried treasure. The journey of these two Morristown gentlemen led them through the hamlet of Smith's Clove, near Stony Point and Haverstraw, now in Rockland County, about 45 miles northeast of here. And there at Smith's Clove, they came upon an affable schoolmaster, a fellow who seemed particularly knowledgeable and perceptive and articulate, an unusual fellow. By the name of Ransford Rogers. Fate would lead this schoolmaster Rogers into the title role of this remarkable morality play, now buried beneath 224 years of Morris County history. The eyewitness tells us, quote, Ransford Rogers had come to Smith's Clove from Connecticut. He was fond of giving hints of his extensive knowledge in every art and science. He claimed he had a copious knowledge of the science of chemistry, and with it he could raise or dispel evil spirits. But he was careful not to actually demonstrate his many claims. Nevertheless, it took little time for the two travelers from Morristown to realize that this clever schoolmaster Rogers from Connecticut was the very man in every way that Morristown needed to recover the gold and silver buried out at Schooley's Mountain. So they invited this fellow, claiming such unusual knowledge and with such a winning personality, to come down to Morristown. Because he was a schoolmaster, they offered him a school to conduct 3 miles west of town, not very far from here. And that gave Ransford Rogers confidence in the men and the gentleman's integrity. He perceived their readiness to arrange for his personal needs, and he felt happy to have such noble sponsors and companions. He accepted their offer to come to Morristown to conduct the school during the daytime. According to a reliable local historian, the school was located along Mendham Road, west of Morristown, somewhere around present-day Washington Valley, just a few miles east of here toward Morristown. That's why I was careful that the door was closed, because you can't tell. Soon after Rogers arrived, he gathered some potential treasure seekers in a barn for horses owned by Mr. Hedges. And there he gave exhibitions of magic tricks. Rogers' entertainments in the barn were accompanied by oratory and dialogues, just as stage magicians still do, to distract your attention and convince you that they're authentic. A local historian tells us that Rogers' exhibition of magic in Mr. Hedges' barn was of a kind so rude, it was a wonder it didn't make the horses, watching all this chicanery, break their halters. But by September, parlor magic in Mr. Hedges' barn was no longer enough. The Morristonians were urging Ransford Rogers to actually exhibit the special art of raising and dispelling ghostly specters, and to actually prove the supernatural abilities that he was claiming. This challenge made Rogers stop and realize that he would be deficient if he were to attempt the illusions he had in mind single-handed. He would need a trustworthy assistant, a magician's helper, if you will, to carry out nocturnal performances in secrecy and with great mystery. So he asked his employers if he could return home and collect his belongings and to attend to some personal business. While on his trip home, he recruited another schoolmaster to come back to Morristown with him, assuring his colleague a lucrative teaching position like his own during the daytime hours. A local historian tells us that Rogers' associate was a trustworthy journeyman, adequate for the task, who went by the odd name Goodenough. Mr. Goodenough, in the true 18th century melodrama for which the two were setting the stage. By late September, the local treasure seekers were persistently urging Ransford Rogers to demonstrate his art of raising apparitions, as he had been engaged to do. They wanted him to get on with recovering the gold and silver they believed buried deep in the bowels of the earth, out in the wilds of Schooley's mountain. The Morristonians' own efforts to recover the treasures out on the mountain had always proven abortive. Whenever they attempted to break ground, apparitions and hobgoblins would seem to arise around them, forcing them to evacuate the place, hastily and empty-handed. In his narrative of 1792, the eyewitness explained, quote, "Now it is well known that when suggestible persons are particularly apprehensive of seeing apparitions, their own imaginations can cause apparitions to seem to arise," unquote. And we know that that odd mental phenomenon is still true now. So Ransford Rogers responded to the urging by gathering his group of prospects to explain the methods they would use to recover the treasures. That first meeting was held under great secrecy and attended by 8 fortune seekers. Ransford Rogers explained the utter solemnity of the business. He described the necessary intricacy of the undertaking. He reminded the group of what they had previously told him, that an immense sum had been deposited on Schooley's mountain, and that several men had been murdered and buried with the money to guard it securely within the earth. A local historian tells us that the treasure seekers held their first meeting outdoors on the rural property of a carpenter named Lum. Mr. Lum was a worthy yeoman, but a man of limited intelligence and a profound believer in witchcraft. Mr. Lum's farm was in an area so remote it was called Solitude. You could reach it by taking the road just west of Rogers School, northeast toward Mount Freedom, near here, near the foot of the mountain there. Solitude was somewhere north of Brookside and Washington Valley, somewhere south of Sussex Avenue. At least it was back in Morris County's late 18th century. Ransford Rogers informed the fortune hunters gathered at Mr. Lum's farm that the guarding spirits must first be raised up and conversed with before the money could be recovered. He declared that he could, by his special art and power, raise the ghostly specters, and the whole company might hear him converse with them, so that all could plainly see that there was no deception going on. That first meeting of the company ended with great assurance and optimism, because all were now confident in the unusual abilities, the knowledge, and the power of Ransford Rogers. The clever schoolmaster had succeeded in capturing the complete confidence of his band of greedy, superstitious, and now eager followers. The charter members of the company were now expecting they would be acquiring vast riches, and they began sharing their outlook with others. There was such a clear prospect now that all would become rich. Many more were anxious to join the company. They convened almost every evening, and more joined at each meeting until their number grew from the original 8 to around 40 men. During that time, no one spoke directly to the spirits except conductor Rogers himself. And he relayed the gist of his conversations to others, and his reports were accepted as completely true. During this period of preparation, Rogers was separately tinkering with chemistry experiments and compounding flammable substances that would explode when thrown into the air, something like fireworks. The sparks and flash would indicate to beholders that a supernatural power had been unleashed. Some of the materials he was developing could be buried in the ground to smolder for several hours and then would explode spontaneously. Rogers, the magician, was setting the stage for a blast from a hole in the earth that would occur unexpectedly, appear dismal in the night, and cause great timidity. And a lot of this language I'm quoting, I'm repeating directly from the 1792 text, but not all of it. The members of the company of treasure seekers was now excited by the prospect of such uncommon curiosities, and all were anxious to proceed. So a night was selected to convene, and although the night turned out to be stormy, as we could have expected, everyone arrived on time. At this meeting, all were astonished to witness an actual interview with a spirit, off in the distance, who told of the importance of the group proceeding together with great order and regularity, or else they could not achieve their objective. The spirit said that they must meet again on such a night and in a certain field a half-mile away from any house, well away from any roads or disturbing noises. The group of 40 must move along together in regular ranks, walking in certain lines and circles, and then proceed in such angles and circles as Ransford Rogers would personally direct. They must remain inside a prescribed circle, or else they would provoke the spirits who would extirpate everyone from the place. Now, when the eyewitness uses words like extirpate in his narrative, you know his account must have been authentic. The designated night finally arrived, and with joy, fear, and trembling, the company convened at the appointed house a half-mile from the appointed field. At 10 o'clock, they proceeded out from the house, walking in the exact angles and circles that Rogers had prescribed at the previous meeting. You do have to picture this scene. Out to the appointed field they walked, moving in peculiar silence and orderly decorum. They found the field bordered by woods on two sides. All sensed, as they walked toward the field, that they were being surrounded by ghostly specters and hobgoblins, who presumably had come in from Schooley's Mountain that dark night to play their parts in this awesome seance. Now it was November, and the night chosen for the meeting was very dark. They formed a circle out in the field, and inside the circle they erected 4 posts to support a cloth, making a tent. And under the tent, Ransford Rogers himself would conduct the ghostly process, which is why they called him the conductor. Now all 40 men then entered the defined circle and commenced walking around inside it, single file. 40 men carefully circling in alternate directions. Try to picture that scene. Candles were lighted, which cast a flickering, ghastly, melancholy light, reaching back toward the edge of the woods. After the company had been rotating in single file and in alternating directions inside the circle, silently and with orderly decorum for a considerable time, they were suddenly shocked by an impetuous explosion blasting up from the earth just a short distance outside the circle. Flames from the blast rose high in the air, illuminating the surroundings. The light revealed dreadful objects back along the woods, moving along strangely. But the view toward the woods was quickly obscured by smoke from the blast, and then by the utter darkness of the night. Then the pretending ghosts made their appearance, off in the dark distance, making hideous groaning noises. They conversed with Ransford Rogers from out beyond visibility, but intentionally within the hearing of the treasure seekers huddled inside the circle. The spirits informed the company that they were guarding vast treasures that they could not give up unless the company proceeded regularly and without any variance. And by the way, every man must first deliver 12 English pounds of money to the spirits, because the buried gold and silver could not be given up until that sum was first received by themselves. And all must acknowledge Ransford Rogers as their chief conductor. The ghosts calling from the distance had muffling devices over their mouths to alter their voices so they could not be recognized. That conference with the ghosts out on that dark night in the remote field lasted until 3 o'clock in the morning. When the séance was over and all had agreed to deliver 12 pounds to the ghostly specters as soon as possible, Ransford Rogers, because he was so keenly perceptive, realized that some of the men might not be able to raise the full 12 pounds. So his abiding generosity induced him to reduce the sum to 6 pounds, and those not able to produce 6 pounds to a mere 4 pounds. Notice that this is just what we would expect a generous philanthropist would do. By now, the members of Morristown's company of treasure seekers had become convinced that this unusual schoolmaster Rogers from Connecticut must be something more than just an ordinary man. Some of the company were now convening almost every night to deliver their own money to the spirits. Whenever they met inside a house, the doors and windows would be made fast shut, and then Ransford Rogers would tell the company about his interviews. From outside the house could be heard unusual voices, causing great timidity. Groaning and clapping on the outside of the house would be heard, and boards would clatter in the bedchamber above. Outside the window could be heard the jingling of coins and a voice from the dark saying, "Press forward." So we know a lot about this story. And then another voice came rattling down the chimney from a ghost perched on top of the roof. That ghost's voice belted out of the fireplace and straight into the room full of trembling treasure seekers. A local historian tells us that one meeting of the company was held out at Reeves Swamp in Roxbury, probably in Roxbury, on a dark night. Each member deposited his cash in turn back behind a certain tree stump off in the swamp. As one man was returning from making his drop behind the designated tree stump, he missed his footing and stumbled headlong into the dark, swampy mud. The man was so angered by falling down in the mud, he turned and went back to retrieve the money he had deposited. But by the time he got back to the stump, his money had already disappeared, whisked away by a quick spirit back there in the darkness, back behind that certain tree stump in Reeves Swamp 224 years ago. All the members of the company were now industrious in trying to raise the money required by the ghosts. They would borrow money or mortgage their farms or sell cattle at half price if necessary to raise the necessary cash. A local historian tells us that a leading member of the fire club was a war hero, Colonel Benoni Hathaway, whose property straddled Bridge Street, which ran from Morristown out to Speedwell Pond and present-day Willow Hall and Speedwell Village, if you know that neighborhood. Colonel Hathaway acted as treasurer of the company, and he dutifully issued receipts for deposits made to the spirits in his own name. After the charade collapsed and the ghosts had vanished, Colonel Hathaway was sued for the cash that he had signed for, to the lasting distress of his personal estate. The eyewitness who was there, seeing all this happen, now tells us that vague rumors were beginning to float around Morristown, and that wives of some of the men of the company were beginning to compare notes. Women were suspecting that something wrong must be going on at what they were calling the fire club. By now it was March of 1789, and Rogers was fearing that something unexpected might happen to upset his fundraising game. Several members of the company were then called out of their beds in the middle of the night by spirits lurking outside their windows. The awakened members were directed by the spirits how to proceed, and afterwards they gathered in us to compare what each had been told in their separate ghost visits. From outside the house that night of the meeting could be heard groaning and jingling of money, and voices telling the members, and I'll quote their message verbatim, "Have faith and be of good cheer, and keep all transactions secret. And come the month of May, you will finally receive the treasure." Now that ghost talk, carefully recorded by the eyewitness, is as authentic as ghost talk as any of us will ever hear. When the appointed night arrived in early May of 1789, the company convened out in an open field. The ghosts immediately appeared well beyond the circle that enclosed the members. But the ghosts now expressed great irritability making hideous groaning noises. They upbraided the company for having not proceeded regularly enough. They said that some were faithless and had divulged secrets, and their wicked dispositions had debarred them from obtaining the buried treasure. The stout-hearted men of Morristown were so intimidated by the ghost's sudden rebuke out in a dark field, so utterly flabbergasted by their rejection, they could not even think about the buried treasure, nor not think about what might have happened to their own money already in the hands of the spirits. A local justice of the peace attended that shocking outdoor session, and he tells us, "I was so scared that I prayed for the Lord to kill the devil." The men of Morristown had thus been stymied and snookered in their greedy pursuit of free gold and silver, and they had been cleverly separated from the deposits they had made of their own money. The eyewitness tells us in his narrative, "Now had Ransford Rogers only stopped there, halted there, while he was ahead, he would have doubtless continued to be feared and respected. But this next diabolical intrigue would diffuse the light and eradicate ignorance from the minds of believers around Morristown." Rogers himself had never intended to proceed any farther, but during the preceding fall, two young men had come down from New England and become intimate with his nefarious operation. These two young men enlisted some new treasure seekers who were eminent characters in the community, and the new recruits were anxious to launch another fire club. The local historian tells us that these two men from New England had been helpers in Rogers' outdoor exhibitions during the previous fall, the assistant ghosts back there on the edge of the dismal woods. And now they were threatening Rogers with exposure if he refused to lead them in a second game. And that's what happens when you turn to a life of crime. Through all this pressure and coercion being exerted on Rogers, he remained enterprising anyway, and was still covetous. He was still greedy enough to proceed with great alacrity in launching a second campaign of fundraising malarkey. That word malarkey was not the word that the eyewitness actually used. For the word malarkey, we're indebted to Joe Biden. Early in the summer of 1789, the first meeting of the second company was held inside a house, with 5 new recruits attending. Groaning noises were heard outside the house, and inside, writing magically appeared on a sheet of deftly shuffled paper. The message said the group should meet again, and it gave directions on how to proceed. When that next night arrived, they met at the house of Ransford Rogers himself. First, the treasure seekers prayed on bended knees. And then they lined up, listen to this, in the sequence of their ages to parade around the room. They rotated around in a circle exactly as many times as there were men marching. You can see that the ghostcraft going on here was precision business, thanks to the consummate skill of Ransford Rogers, the conductor. Then a message appeared on one of the double shuffled papers saying that the company should now expand to 11 members, and that each must deposit 12 pounds in gold or silver to the spirit's accounts. Soon after, Ransford Rogers made a nocturnal visit to one of his followers, dressed in a white ghost sheet. From outside that house, in the middle of the night, Rogers, speaking as the ghost, reported that another company of treasure seekers was now pursuing the buried treasure also, and that the ghost could not give it up unless upstanding members of the local church joined their group. The eyewitness did not explain the reasons for that, but it must have made some sense at the time. Said Ghost Rogers through his muffling voice, and I say this exactly as it was said then: "Fear not, but go to Ransford Rogers and inform him of your interview with me. Fear not, for I am ever with you." See, you can't tell who was saying that, right? Because it confused the voice. A local historian tells us that another meeting of the spirit batch was held in June of 1789 in the leather tanning yard of Colonel Benoni Hathaway. Conductor Rogers ordered everyone to close their eyes as a new member was inducted and deposited his money. But the new member wanted to see an actual ghost for himself. So instead of closing his eyes completely, he peeked through his covering fingers at the ghost. The ghost could see that the new member was peeking, and it glided directly toward the disobedient reprobate. The peeking member was so startled by the ghost's approach, he impulsively jumped backwards, and so rapidly he fell head over heels in a large vat of bark liquor used for tanning leather. His companions rescued him from the vat, but in all the confusion, the ghost had vanished, as we all know ghosts will do, but not before whisking away the money that the new member had deposited. The eyewitness tells us that on another occasion, the company convened inside a certain house. Noises could be heard outside with groaning, rapping on windows, and jingling of money. A muffled voice outside could then be heard, "Look to God." Each member then tied a white handkerchief around his head. Picture this scene. And then another handkerchief around his waist. And they marched with great decorum out to a meadow 100 yards away from the house. Out in the dark meadow, after an adroit double shuffling of magic papers, a message appeared on one of them saying, and I quote this message from the ghost verbatim, "O faithless man, what more need I exhibit to you? I am the spirit of a just man, sent from heaven to declare these things unto you. And I can have no rest until I have delivered great possessions into your hands. But look to God, for there is still greater treasure in heaven for you. O faithless men, press forward in faith, and the prize shall be yours." Using his extensive knowledge of chemistry, Rogers concocted some pills that contained a substance that would make the lips and mouth swell up unless they were swigged down quickly with a generous drink. And the drink he recommended for swigging the pills down quickly was liquor. And that, you may not be surprised to learn, that potent antidote for his own nasty pills would lead to the conductor's downfall. Rogers then proceeded to encourage profuse drinking of liquor, probably applejack or whiskey, by the members of the company, both before and during the seances. And it's easy for us to understand, even now, how that might lead the ghost persons themselves to take up liquor drinking on the job. A local historian reported that an incredible demonstration of ghostcraft on the rooftops of Morristown that summer of 1789. Late one night, a figure dressed in ghostly sheets was seen to fly off the roof of the Morris County Courthouse, which then stood on the northwest corner of Morristown Green, where the Century 1 store stands now. The figure glided through the air to the roof of a tavern next door. During its miraculous glide, the ghostly figure warned witnesses down below that they should flee from wrath left yet to come. Some try to explain that aerial flight opposite Morristown Green as a tightrope walking act. Or he could have been hanging from a pulley wheel rolling along a taut rope. But whatever method of flight the ghost was using, his audacity was clearly rising toward a zenith and was heading toward an inevitable fall. Before another seance, Ransford Rogers pulverized some dry animal bones, declaring it to be the dust of spirits' bodies. Each member was then given some of this bone powder in a sealed paper as tangible proof that he was one of the chosen company. But no one dared touch the powder upon his peril. The spirits then ordered liquor to be drunk very freely, and each downed a hearty dram, and then they all united in all the more fervent prayer. And then that meeting was adjourned. One of the older members of the company operated a grist mill on the north side of town, believed by historians to have been Alexander Carmichael. One night, Mr. Carmichael carelessly left his packet of dust in his pocket. His wife had been suspicious of the company's activities all along, and she found the packet in his pocket. Mrs. Carmichael broke it open and took the strange powder to the church pastor for advice. But the good man dared not touch it for fear of ill effect. She and her neighbor friend had been exercised for some time over the strange goings-on of their husbands. They talked frequently about the ghost happenings, and then Mrs. Carmichael discovered the packet of bone dust in her superstitious husband's pocket. On another night, Aaron Kitchell of present East Hanover, who later became a U.S. Senator, came to the haunted spot armed with a 5-foot 3-inch rifle he called Old Hager. Kitchell offered to test the mortality of the ghost with a single shot fired from his accurate rifle, delivered from anywhere within 10 rods distance. But the ghost declined his challenge, and its reluctance to stand up to the test caused doubts to rise in the minds of the treasure seekers. These setbacks and challenges were now creating uncertainty and disturbance among the company members. Faith in the credibility of the all-powerful conductor was beginning to waver, Rogers responded by coming out solo in his ghost uniform every night, desperately trying to restore the faith of the members. On one of these nights, Rogers followed his own advice and drank too much of the good creature himself. And on that fateful night, he took his white sheet and rode to the house of a certain influential member to converse as a spirit outside the member's window. But on that night, liquor conspired to slur the ghost's tongue. As we all know, liquor will do. The liquor has caused the ghost to make some blunders as it was stammering through the voice of a spirit. The woman of the house noticed the slurring and stammering and the strangely muffled voice outside, and it caused her to suspect that the apparition hovering beneath their window might actually be an ordinary man, after all. And here we can see one of the morals of this morality play. Liquor is something that can get even ghosts into serious trouble. A local historian tells us that the gentleman's wife caught a glimpse of the hastily costumed ghost beneath their window. And the next morning she asked her husband, and I quote, "Does thou deem it proper for ghosts to wear silver shoe buckles?" Now we can see another moral of the story. Women had more common sense than men did at that point in time. The next morning, the man of the house went outside, and there in the fresh dew, he found what looked like foot tracks of an ordinary man. He followed the ordinary tracks to where a horse had been tied up and had left ordinary hoof prints. Then he followed the ordinary hoof prints straight to the house of Schoolmaster Rogers. From Rogers' house, the ordinary hoof prints led straight on to the house of the neighbor from whom Rogers had borrowed the horse. And there, at the end of the trail of ordinary foot tracks and ordinary hoof prints, Mr. Carmichael found Ransford Rogers himself in ordinary flesh and blood. Now, are you clapping because the villain has finally been cornered? Have you turned on the poor fellow? Yes. Oh. Now, all the evidence mounting against Rogers was all circumstantial, of course. But nevertheless, it was deemed sufficient to convict the chief conductor for his money-extorting escapade. So they arrested him and clapped him in Morristown jail. A local innkeeper named Benjamin Freeman put up 50 English pounds to bail Rogers out of jail. But as soon as the caged bird was freed, he immediately took flight. And so Freeman had to forfeit his bail bond. Rogers was then apprehended a second time. And this time he confessed his faults and owned up to his conduct. He admitted that he deserved punishment, and back into jail they threw him. But as clever ghost persons seem able to do, Rogers managed to slip out of Morristown jail a second time. And this time he fled in great haste back to New England without opportunity to gather his personal effects. They seized the belongings he left behind, and among them they found an incriminating pair of silver shoe buckles. Now, this historical narrative was handed down by someone who signed it a philanthropist. But he should have called himself a philosopher, because like many true stories, and even parables in the Bible, that have been told and retold thousands of times over thousands of years, this timeless story of a history story about wrong and its consequences has the clear character of a morality play, a true one that actually happened right around here. And morality plays always end in a moral to teach us something. Ransford Rogers absconded for home to Connecticut so hastily after escaping from jail, he didn't have time to retrieve the proceeds of his extortion game. He had buried his winnings in gold and silver for safekeeping in a box, not out on Schooley's mountain, but beneath a certain white oak tree behind the Morristown home of Squire Benjamin Lindsley. Soon after he got back to Connecticut, Rogers sent a trusted colleague back to Morristown with instructions for where to find the money he had left behind, buried beneath Squire Lindsley's white oak tree. Rogers' courier arrived in Morristown and took lodging at a local tavern for the night. It might have been the tavern of Rogers' bail bondsman, Benjamin Freeman. Staying there at the tavern that night also was a local youth who appeared to be drunk and asleep. Rogers' courier asked the innkeeper for directions for how to find Benjamin Lindsley's house and about a certain white oak tree there in his yard. But the young man, who seemed to be asleep, was only pretending to be drunk and sleeping. He was actually listening carefully to the stranger's questions. And he, like everyone else in Morristown, was keenly aware of the shenanigans of the recently absconded Ransford Rogers. This young man's intuition gave him a hunch that the stranger at the tavern might have come looking for something that Rogers had left behind in his hasty departure. A local historian tells us that this youth quietly arose from his pretended drunken sleep and slipped out of the tavern. He went directly to Squire Lindsley's white oak tree, and there he dug up the buried gold and silver, undeterred by any hobgoblins, and spirited the treasure away to vanish along with it from our local history records forever. Later in the middle of the same night, Rogers' bagman arrived at the same spot, behind Squire Lindsley's house, there on the same mission. But when he got there, he found that the money chest was already gone. The chest had been robbed from its hole in the ground, stolen by some undeserving common thief. The winnings of Ransford Rogers' whole year of laborious extortion work at Morristown was gone. Now that tragic outcome alone would have been enough to drive home the moral of this morality play. But the eyewitness went on to conclude his narrative of the Morristown ghost, written 4 years after the affair, with what sounds like it could have been a wise schoolteacher's lesson in philosophy. Here is what he says. It is almost incredible to believe that such imposition could be practiced on mankind in this enlightened period. But human nature still remains the same and will perpetuate enormous deeds to satisfy a greedy mind. And if we admit the same disposition of greed to reign as predominant in the deceived as in the deceiver, then let the deceived pay their money to the deceiver, who, after all, has been to considerable trouble and expense in acquiring his fine art of extracting. Because those who go to the school of experience should expect to pay dearly for their tuition. Ladies and gentlemen, yours in amity, a philanthropist. And that's how the eyewitness ended his story. Are there any questions? Are there any questions? When we did this for an evening's entertainment for the Morristown Historical Society, we had 6 readers in reading in sequence the parts of the story. We had 6 ghosts that played the part of the ghosts. We had 2 opera singers and an accompanist that sang opera that had been written a few years before at Fairleigh Dickinson. And we had a stage magician. So it was a production that was an evening's entertainment, 2 hours and a half, and we actually raised some money. But when I realized that it took how much effort that it took at that time, and that's not easy to make happen again, that 23 years ago is when that happened. I realized that this needed to be reduced to a shorter story. If you think this was long, this is a short version. This is a short version of the whole story. Any questions?
Yeah, when do we go get the treasure on Schooley's Magic?
Tomorrow you can go and bring it back to us. Any other questions? This is a true story. You probably... Pardon?
Was any treasure actually found on Schooley's?
Well, an empty chest came back, and it's in the collections of Morristown National Historical Park, but that's as close as we came to anything specific.
As long as the story's being told, this youth that took the money, did he keep it or I don't know?
The account here was a local one. He buried the money, and a young man went and dug it up and took it home. There were 2 other accounts where he claimed that when he got back to Connecticut that he had collected $10,000 from this exercise. He was bragging. And there was another account saying it was $1,500. But the more likely account is the one that was recorded here. This fellow was... we have to question his trustworthiness a little bit. And the likelihood is that he took next to nothing of it home. And that's what can happen when you fall for the line of somebody that you don't trust. That's the moral. Yeah.
Don, for his day job, what was he teaching in a one-room schoolhouse?
Yes. The 2. Ransford Rogers had a schoolhouse, and his chief assistant, Mr. Goodenough, had another school in another schoolhouse. Yes, and that schoolhouse was on Mendham Road. It was about 4 miles toward Morristown from here. Where exactly, we don't know, but you can't know everything. These old buildings don't last.
Brookside?
It was probably just beyond Brookside, probably around where Washington Valley. We don't know the precise location, but that's close enough to understand what happened and where it happened. And it makes it a very local story for the Mendham Borough Historical Society. So, and any other questions? All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Don. And thank you all. And safe home. Don't let the hobgoblins get you.